Welcome to Chapter 3 of our sports management class from the ACSM Health and Fitness Facility Standards and Guidelines book. This is Chapter 3, Risk Management and Emergency Policies. Going to go through this here, just kind of going through the day-to-day operation kind of side of everything. This relates more to what are you following? What procedures are you going to go through? What is it that you're going to do on a day-to-day basis that's going to get you to that diminishing of liability, all right, in terms of that risk management component. So ultimately the whole aspect of this is, what is risk management? Risk management really is about, how do we implement ideas, strategies, tried, true, and tested to avoid liability. All right. Now, the true purpose, like it says here, is the practices and systems that businesses put in place to reduce or limit their exposure to potential liability and financial loss. Now, remember, with exposed liability comes that financial loss, because normally it would result in a lawsuit or something along those lines. All right. So what do we have to do as far as health clubs, strength and conditioning facilities, CrossFit gyms, studios, any of these places that we would work at? It's more or less, what are we doing? Okay. What are we doing as clubs to help diminish? Okay. So practices and procedures and systems the club used to reduce risk of having employees, members, and users experience an event of harm to the individual and perhaps the business entity itself. So ultimately, we're looking at it from that standpoint of, we don't want and it goes to our own people, our employees, and then obviously our own people as in our members, and members and users kind of interchangeably. Users can be people that come in that don't necessarily have a membership but are still kind of using that system. Okay. So we are really, 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 really trying to diminish that liability, which then will diminish the cost that is associated with you providing a risk, and which we don't want. That's not a good thing. So that's really what we want with risk management, is how do we manage that risk? How do we put these procedures in place so that we can ultimately diminish any potential liability? Although, as we all know, there always is a chance for, but we want to just try to be more, again, we want to be preventative versus reactionary. All right. So what are they talking about in terms of the standards for risk management? Okay. Written emergency responses. All facility operators need to have these written emergency response policies and procedures. They're regularly reviewed. They should be rehearsed. Now, you might see it says twice annually. That might be biannual, whatever term you want to use for that. But staff need to be able to respond in a critical situation. Okay, that's first aid or emergency. Now, by rehearsing, it becomes that, I don't really like the term, but it is used purposely for this, as muscle memory. In this case, we want our brains and our body to react the same way every time. All right. Now, if you've ever been in the military, that's the whole advent of what they're trying to do, is by putting you through all those situations. Their whole purpose is to make it so that it becomes second nature and that you don't forget those policies and procedures that you've learned. So here it's the same way. Okay. So what do we want to make sure of? Okay. Local healthcare and medical personnel are there to help you create these standards. Okay. There's an emergency response system that needs to address all major emergency situations. That could be anything from a heart attack and a stroke to if somebody passes out from a diabetic. It just doesn't, it could be anything major. Okay. Then it becomes a little bit more, it should be a little bit less broad, where that emergency response systems must provide explicit steps or instructions on how each situation will be handled regarding each role of first responder, second responder, third responder. First responder is the first person on the scene, second and third, and then how do we delegate? That is something that you learn in the first aid of your courses. If you're ever taking first aid and BLS, then they teach you, okay, if you're the first one on, what is it that you're going to do? You're the role, you're the role assigner. But also, if you don't feel comfortable, then the second responder, if they feel as though they're a little bit better involved with that, then they can be the one that then you just swap roles. All right. Emergency response systems must be fully documented. All right. So you need to make sure all the information is there. It's easily accessible by staff, and it's something that you as a person need to understand is always available to you, so that in case of any situations, it's always there. Okay? There's that 2 times per year. That's that biannually. And then, where are your first aid kits? Where are your medical equipment? Where are your supplies? All of those things matter at that time. Okay? And then lastly, you need to make sure that we want to identify what is called a local coordinator. And that local coordinator is that member of the staff who is in charge of making sure that your facility is emergency ready. Okay? And that by being emergency ready, that you will avoid any unwanted situations in the time of an emergency during the response protocol. Okay? That's critical in that time. Okay? That is really critical in that time. So that local coordinator is all things emergency response. That's their goal. Standard number 2, operators shall ensure that a safety audit is conducted, routinely inspecting all areas of the facility, trying to make things become apparent so that you can eliminate any hazards that are there. That's really the main thing here, because the hazards ultimately cause injuries, and then it becomes an issue where not only the employees but also the users, members, they all can become affected by those unsafe hazards or unsafe conditions. So we always want to make sure of that. Now, what do we got to make sure of? There's an awareness of conditions within the facility posing the increased risk. You need to be placed in awareness of these conditions, and if you don't respond to them, that's a liability on your end. Audits or inspections are done regularly. There are checklists so at my CrossFit gym that I coach at, there is a checklist that has all the things that we need to go over each day, if not each week, to know are we in compliance with specific standards. Okay? And then obviously there should be a goal for your scheduled inspections. When are you going to do them? How often? Is it monthly, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever it might be? And then one of the things that you have to be aware of, whether it's electronically or paper-based, you have to make sure that you maintain your files for at least 3 years. Always, always, always err on the side of caution. It's like your income tax, right? You do your W-2s, you get your 1040, and that tells you how much income tax money you're going to get back, or if you have to pay in. Well, you don't just rip those up and throw them away. You have to keep them for a certain time so that so if anything ever happens, we know that we're in compliance later on. That's the main thing that we want to understand. Now, number 3 has a whole bunch of things that are there, and it's very small. But one of the things I want you to be aware of with this one here is basically that there is basic needs for hazardous materials, handling of bodily fluids, and all of that falls under OSHA. Now, there is OSHA material inside of your class, all right? But if you're wanting more, just look up OSHA, and it'll give you how do you store, how do you take care of bodily fluids? Is there a specific standard that you have to follow? Well, there is in terms of the facility in regards to material safety data sheets, and that is for pretty much almost every chemical that would be used inside of a fitness facility or a major facility that houses a bunch of workers. And that gives you everything that you need to know about proper locations, proper storage, and then it also gives you proper safety training on how to handle. And in any case, is there appropriate signage that's along for the ride? Okay. And then for bodily fluids, it's a handling. It's what we need to wear. The barriers for the PP, personal protective equipment, PPE. All right. All of those things are there and meant to be for that purpose. Now, if you have the book, you can always go into the Appendix B section and you'll find all of this kind of in there, nice and tidy for you. All right. But do you know what a biohazard container is? Do you know what a biohazard, or another version of that would be, do you know what a sharps container is? Do we have those? Where are the goggles? Where are the masks? Where are the aprons? Where are the gloves? Where is the bleach located? Well, bleach is usually your first indicator for any sort of blood-based material. So all of this OSHA-based stuff goes into that. Okay. And then the 4th thing is making sure that we're in compliance with federal, state, and local requirements for AEDs. And then they call it a PAD, a public access defibrillator program, meaning that, in public areas, are there specific procedures and guidelines that you need to follow to make sure of that? Now, AED is very tricky. I'm unaware of, but I still want to say that it is not a requirement, and it's kind of, I think now it's kind of like frowned upon if these facilities do not carry an AED. And really, if you're a facility owner, or if you're managing it, or even if you work there and you know there's no AED on site, that is something you want to bring up to your people, your management, your owner, whoever it is that you're working for, because why risk it? We're not saying that something's going to ever happen at your facility, but it might, and you don't want to think about it from that perspective, but you never know. All right. And, I've been on the unfortunate end where a gym that I worked for down in Fort Lauderdale, we had a firefighter that passed away in the gym. Well, he basically, and to sum it all up, he had an issue inside of the gym and he went out in the gym. Now, he died a few days later, but, we had a major event, life-threatening, and it did threaten his life and it did take his life. And it was one of those things where they had the AED, they got him back working again, but I think it was because he was without oxygen for so long, and it was right after a workout, so his body was still in flux, that we had an issue with, he got revived, but I believe that the lack of oxygen to his brain was pretty much the downfall and the shutdown of all of his major organs. So, again, if people weren't there to handle that situation, he probably would have died on site. But because we had proper personnel that were involved in the process, knew how to use an AED, knew how to do, basic lifesaver, so we're talking about major, areas of, not just certification, but qualification to do this. We saved him for the interim, but it just didn't pan out later. So it's very traumatic. And that's why just having an AED on site is just enough peace of mind. So, again, think about that from that standard perspective of, if your facility that you work at later on or now currently doesn't have one, then, might be worth the conversation. All right. So with that, again, remember PAD is that public access defibrillator. It's listed right here in the step, the page before. That is used AEDs to respond to specific situations. And then at that point, it's like, what does the AED do? Well, it gets you back into that heart rhythm if you can. It is the third step in the American Heart Association's chain of survival. And then there's all your statistics. Okay. There's a 7 to 10% decrease in the survival for every minute delayed using a defibrillator. So if you wait 3 minutes, you're potentially lowering by 20, well, it's 21, but really 20 to 30% decrease in survival. Well, why take the chance? Get it done, do the work correctly, and make sure you use it as soon as possible if all else fails. And there you go. Your survival rates, as high as 90%, but then look what happens. At 5 minutes, you become 50% of survival, 7 minutes, more prolonged, 30%, 9 minutes, 10%, and look at 12 minutes post-episode, then you're talking about slim chance, 2 to 5%. So it's very, 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 very scary about how it's the third step in the chain of survival, but why aren't gyms or other fitness facilities using them, right? So let's be more apparent of this and let our facilities know that we need them, all right? Now, what is the goal here? The goal here is that you should strive for a response time of 4 minutes or less. All right. That, at that point there, you want to make sure that, according to the FDA, it is required that a physician should be the one that prescribes an AED before purchase. Make sure that you have the right one. All right. It's part of your emergency plan. All right. And at that point, it should coordinate with local emergency medical services. All right. All incidents need to be documented within 24 hours. Me personally, 24 hours is a guideline or a standard, but really it's the sooner the better. And the reason why, what happened. I understand that things happen immediately afterwards, and sometimes your brain can be a little fried because you went through a traumatic situation. But the sooner that you can document everything, the better off you are, because it's fresh in your mind. After 24 hours, you start losing those little bitty pieces of necessary information. So, and then Make sure, just like we were talking about before, having a local coordinator, have an AED coordinator who should probably be your local coordinator anyway, all things emergency. All right. And then if you have an AED on site, make sure that everybody, now I say that, that's my personal belief, but at the same time, if you have an AED, everybody should be trained in how to use an AED, from the front desk people to your, cleaning staff. Everybody should know how to use it, because what happened, just in case, you never know when it'll happen and who might need to be there to help assist a certain person. All right. So we got to make sure of that. Got to make sure that we're properly training at least the right people that we feel comfortable training, but the more the merrier, and someone who doesn't feel comfortable isn't going to step up to the plate to use an AED anyway, but at least they know what's going on. We'd rather have that than nothing. So, standard 5, in a facility, you should be at least a minute and a half walk. Now, a minute and a half walk, you're talking about, 3/4 of a minute, maybe 45 seconds of a run, if not shorter. So we have to make sure we take a lot of things into consideration here. Where are you locating? Where are you putting this AED? Is it centralized? Do you have more than one? Are there more than one floor? So we have to always take these things into consideration when it comes to this standard, right? If it has to be a mile and a half, a minute and a half walk, then we got to make sure that AED is properly placed. That's the bottom line. Whether it's upstairs, downstairs, and you have a 2-floor, 1-floor building, either way, it's got to be that, even if you walk to it for a minute and a half and then walk back, then at least you know that it's in the right place, so that if you have to be more expedited, speedier, then you would be in a better position for that. All right. There you go. There's your preparation and practice. Skills reviews, practice sessions, practice drills. Every 6 months, if, at a minimum once a year, but we got to make sure that we're getting, AED, you have to, I think it's every 2 years that the American Heart Association requires now, but, every 6 months you should be practicing it to keep that certification fresh. Now, there are other things you have to take into consideration here, and that's with that practice. If there's water present, if you put pads on somebody and there's water there, you're going to electrocute them. Is there the presence of a pacemaker? If there's a pacemaker, then that means we have to be aware of that. And, are we allowed to use it in that sense? Are we not allowed to? Are we using, we have to be aware of, and that's where we need to know that about that person. So that's why having a proper waiver and the proper health history questionnaires or health risk assessments are there, because if we know that, if we pull that person's file in the process of trying to provide them services, emergency services, we can justify if we know they have a pacemaker or not. Are they on certain medications? Is it an adult versus a child? And then placement of that pad or pads, depending upon if they are a child or an adult. And all of this will help you in that real world situation to kind of make it, if you make the practice more lifelike, then you'll act more accordingly in a life-threatening situation. So that's always key here is review, practice, practice. Review, have practice sessions and practice drills. And sometimes it might even be worth having, it's kind of sketchy, but having a real life situation that's unannounced to see how people react, even though we know it's only a drill and only certain people know it's a drill. Because then you're taking it by shock value like a real situation would. So again, we talked about having everybody trained and everything like that in terms of BLS, CPR, and AED. But understand that, like it says here, a staffed facility shall assign at least one staff member to be on duty during all facility operating hours who is trained and certified. So if you have 2 crews, just say you have a morning crew and a night crew, then at least one member needs to be aware, needs to be trained and certified to do BLS and AED at a minimum. But the more people that know, the better response you'll have, even if there's only the one person doing the CPR and only one person administering the AED. Everybody else knows how to handle the situation around them, so that it makes it less scary and it makes it less, there's less questions and people understand what's going on so they can help better. Then standard 8 is if you're working in unstaffed facilities, meaning if you're working at like a 24-hour gym that's open and there's nobody on duty and all that's really there are cameras, you still need to be there still has to be AED requirements. All right. So normally you'll have emergency panic buttons, you'll have emergency pull switches, and all of that will basically, if there's ever an emergency, it'll make the phone call to EMS. It'll actually alert usually the owner or the general manager or whoever the response person is that there's a situation at the facility in an unstaffed time frame. So therefore, if somebody is there with you, that even though it's unstaffed, just say there's another person on site, they have access to an AED. All right. So like I said, there's video monitoring, there's panic buttons, there is a phone that is always accessible, meaning you can't have that phone behind a desk hidden so that a person can't make an emergency phone call. And an AED needs to be in a visible location. And that's really going to help to make sure that even if there is a person who's qualified and certified to use the AED that's not part of your staffing, they can respond in an appropriate manner. So guideline-wise, assumption of risk or a waiver is going to be able to help you with this. We want to make sure, again, this is why we talked about in Chapter 2, appropriate documentation is really necessary. Okay? So therefore, we want to make sure that you know that in a waiver, you're accepting all risk and liability because you signed off saying you understand that exercise really it comes with some risk, which we all know. But again, if you're unhealthy, it's even more of a risk because it's putting you in a bad situation. So waivers of liability and assumption of risk documentation needs to be on staff. So therefore, you cannot and should not allow a person to work out if they haven't signed a waiver. Because at any point something could happen and that's liability on you. Making sure that you are delivering and prescribing appropriate programs. Okay? So you have to be aware that at any point, right, any member or user who is at a higher risk can still take part in them, but you need to make sure that they have been, I guess the best way to put it would be they've had the screenings necessary so that, at least who might be of concern, and then you can have a response protocol in place with the directives of medical directors, liaisons, and advisory committees that can help you in terms of those high-risk situations. Guideline 3, there should always be a proper level of supervision. All right. Different areas need different levels. Different sizes of facilities need different levels. Different types of facilities, like are you a strength and conditioning? Are you a general workout? Are you a studio? All of them require different levels of supervision. So therefore, you have to make sure that you're active in those responses. Supervision and monitoring are critical to reduction of risk, along with everything else that we've obviously talked about here. All areas need to have a clock, a chart, target heart rate chart, and then rating of perceived exertion charts so that you can self-monitor. Now, this is for places that you work out on your own, meaning like a regular traditional, big box gym that, you work on a treadmill or an elliptical, no one's supervising you. You work out at like a strength and conditioning facility or a CrossFit gym, you're being supervised. So therefore, those types of places don't really need a target heart rate chart, a rating of perceived exertions chart, because you have somebody who's guiding you and helping you, knowing what your level of exertion is. And those coaches need to be qualified and certified and being able to see when someone is not up to par. Meaning like, if you realize that person is like dead in the water, but exertionally wise, you need to control and monitor their amount of exertion so that they don't push beyond a limit that something happens to them. That's why monitoring and, basic monitoring and evaluating your people is critical, because you can do this in an environment like a Planet Fitness or your local big box gym. They have these things there that can help them with monitoring, and they should be educated on that, whether that's through, again, when we talk about orientations and proper communication with the members, how do they monitor? This can be part of that. Again, extend to each employee on the staff the opportunity to get training and certification. Absolutely. Have a staff day where everybody gets trained. But again, we have to make sure at least one person who is on site every shift is able to provide CPR, BLS, or AED training usage. Can they? They'll be able to provide it if possible, if needed. Guideline 6, incident reporting system that provides written documentation of all incidences that occur within the facility or within the facility scope of responsibility. That so again, if it's out in the parking lot, that's still part of it. Okay, but again, timely fashion. We said within 24 hours. All right, and we need to make sure we submit them to the right people so that we have that on file in case something like questions, or if there's a need, if you are subpoenaed to be part of a trial, that everything was done accordingly and within the reason that you were supposed to. All right, and that's the end of our show there. But yeah, you can see where all of these things make total sense in the grand scheme of how do we provide risk management and how do we set it up to make sure that everybody has the right tools to diminish liability, and also just to diminish the fact that there would even be an event in the first place, right? So by evaluating and assessing your facilities, by overlooking everything that needs to be overlooked and with a fine-tooth comb, having your policies and procedures in place, making sure that you have BLS and CPR, BLS/CPR and AED trained for certified people on staff, making sure that you have the proper timely documentation if something were to occur, and not even just for if a situation occurred, but a documentation for everything that are you checking your equipment daily? And that's going to be in the equipment chapter as well. Are you checking the equipment weekly or daily or bi-weekly? Are you checking the bathrooms for hazards? All of those things matter. Okay, all of those things really matter. So we have to make sure we constantly pay attention to that. So this is chapter 3. Remember, take a look at this with fine-tooth comb. This is what you'll be tested on. So we want to make sure we have all of our standards and guidelines on point. All right. If there's ever any questions, please reach out. We'll see what we can do. Have a wonderful day.